I'm so pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, Ben Rhodes, and as you know, I think most of you know, he was Deputy National Security Advisor and speechwriter for former President Barack Obama. He is the author of a new book, After the Fall, The Rise of Authoritarianism in the World We've Made. Just so you know, you can purchase the book in the museum bookstore at the entrance if you don't already have one. And after the talk, he'll have a chance to sign some of them. He's also written a New York Times bestseller called The World as It Is, a memoir of the Obama White House. Ben co-hosts Pod Save the World, a foreign policy podcast. I subscribe, I love it. It's raucous, it's great. He's a frequent commentator on NBC News, MSNBC, and other news outlets, where he shares his laser sharp and sometimes, I'll say, often sharp-tongued perspectives. Really, really good stuff. Global Santa Fe's board member Jim Falk is our program committee chair, and he's been my right hand during my first few months on the job. Many of you know this, I'm in my third month. Anyway, Jim will engage in conversation with Ben here about the global factors and forces that are creating really dramatic upheavals and reshaping our world right this moment. So I'd like to thank the Global Santa Fe team for arranging tonight's event and thank all of you for joining us for what I know will be a lively discussion. You'll have the opportunity to ask a few questions. And now would be a good time to silence your cell phones. And Jim, take her away. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. You know, the big thank you I want to say is obviously to Ben, but also to Delta. My God. I was sitting there, Ben, in that lot, looking at it, and it goes 1 minute delay, 2 minute delay. Now it's ahead. And, you know, we made it. We're just like 2 minutes late, so good to see everybody. Welcome, Ben. This is a wonderful book. In fact, I've read the book 2.5 times. Because Ben was supposed to come to Dallas, and then because of COVID, it was prevented. And so about 6 months later, he came, and I read the book again. But I really do encourage you to pick up a copy, and I know some of you have brought copies. Ben, you know, the book really is almost an introduction to what we're seeing now. And we're going to talk about the book, but let's just go right into what we're seeing with Ukraine. When we were driving here, you told me that you've been in the room more than you wish you had been with Vladimir Putin. You saw a soul. What did you see?
It's good to be with you again in a different city.
Yep.
And it's great to be here in Santa Fe. I've never been here. I've always wanted to come here. Yeah. It's shame on me, I guess, right? I've been to Albuquerque a bunch, but beautiful place here. In terms of being in the room with Putin, and this book I set out to essentially answer the question of why is everything moving in the wrong direction politically in the world and in this country, and why is there this particular flavor of authoritarianism that is this kind of blend of ethno-nationalist, grievance-fueled, us versus them politics fused with corruption. And so instead of it being fused with an ideology, communism or the ideological battles of the 20th century, it's a politics of grievance fueled to enormous corruption. And when you're in the room with Putin, you get a sense of why he's the avatar of that political trend in the world, which again has rippled out, including into the United States. And what I mean by that, the first is that he, incredibly arrogant person. The first time I remember that Obama met him after Putin came back to the presidency, Putin was 45 minutes late. And it was like, by the way, we were at the G20 in Cabo, so it's not like it was, really inconveniencing us. We were just hanging out by the beach, he was just to make some point, And then he's incredibly argumentative, and it's entirely whataboutism, right? So, Obama would say, would be arguing against, obviously, something like the invasion of eastern Ukraine, and all you get in response is, well, you guys were actually funding the protesters who overthrew the democratically elected peaceful government, and trying to just draw you into some totally kind of grievance-fueled set of arguments that are kind of irrelevant to solving a problem, but you would leave these 2-hour conversations with Putin not knowing whether he believes what he's saying or not. Like, is this just a kind of debating tactic? Is he just obfuscating, or does he really believe that the United States is behind kind of every rock in his neighborhood? And I think it's more the latter. I mean, I think this war in many ways confirms, like, no, he believes a lot of this stuff, which we can get into. But then I mentioned the corruption and the oligarchy. The reason that's evident in the room with Putin is, there are these Russian diplomats who never go away, right? Sergei Lavrov, he's the foreign minister, has been for 20 years. And he's a very intelligent guy. Like, if you get him, in a conversation on the margins of something, he's not an idiot, he's not dumb, and he doesn't come across as some ideologue. But then when they're in the room with Putin, it is like you can sense the sycophancy in that direction, and you can sense the like stern-faced, hardline, everybody's performing for the boss thing, which we didn't have in the same way when Dmitry Medvedev was president of Russia.
He was progressive in a way, wasn't
Well,
he?
it looks relatively, but yeah, so this is an interesting point. Like, Medvedev, for those of you who don't remember, was president from 2008 to 2012, and essentially Putin was the prime minister at that time, and so it was pretty clear that Putin was still the power behind the Kremlin. But Medvedev was the guy showing up at summits and doing business, and he was very much he looked like he should be a Russian oligarch in London. You could tell he was a Western-oriented guy. He wanted to reform Russia's economy. Like, this was sincere. He wanted to create a tech sector, and he came to Silicon Valley and he looked at it, and he had our experts going to figure out how to set up legal frameworks for this. Because Putin doesn't need a tech sector, he just needs the oil and gas that comes out of the ground that makes him rich. And the question was always whether Putin was going to return to the presidency, and obviously the moment that Putin stood up next to Medvedev and announced not only was Putin going to run for president, but that had been the plan all along, that was kind of the end of a certain kind of democracy in Russia, because there was a signal that Putin will never leave power, and that this kind of brief moment where it seemed like Medvedev might represent, if not lead, a bit more of a Western drift. That all ended at that moment in 2012, and it really matters because early in the Obama years, Putin was the power, but there were different camps. There was like the military, the FSB, the former KGB guys, but then there really were kind of like liberals, but I mean, liberals, I'd say this with air quotes because these guys are not particularly liberal, but they're people who wanted to get closer to the West, right. People who wanted to diversify the economy. And Putin used to have to kind of navigate between these camps. By the end of the Obama years, the only camp was the FSB guys. Like, that was the only people he was listening to. And by now, I think it's an inner circle of one person. And so it's that evolution of an autocrat having a shrinking circle around him that leads us to where we are.
Well, we really saw that when that Security Council met.
Yeah. And that was truly extraordinary. I mean, this is a guy, Putin, who, 20 years ago when he comes to the presidency, really has to give the appearance that he is the leader of a democracy. And he's also not the only source of power in the country. And if you look at 20 years later, the Security Council meeting on the eve of the war, where very powerful men are in this room, like just terrified. Like on their faces, they look terrified. They don't know what the right answer is, and you can tell that they're like, that it's almost like, I hate to make light of it, but like you'd almost expect like the button to go, open up the floor underneath them if they say anything wrong. And these are guys who like run, the FSB, right? And this is Putin making he's often made his point through like an example. So like he doesn't have to kill and imprison everybody in the country. He has to make an example of people, right? So he, early on in his presidency, when Russia still felt pretty open if you were in Russia, well, one journalist starts reporting something Putin doesn't like and gets killed in ambiguous circumstances, that's a message to all the other journalists. You don't have to go around killing all the journalists. So, like, the message has been delivered. And Zhana Nemtsova, who I profile in this book, her father, Boris Nemtsov, was one of the most leading opposition politicians to Putin. He's assassinated under murky circumstances in the shadow of the Kremlin in 2015. Well, that sends out its own message. And in that meeting, Putin like humiliated the head of the FSB, the head of the Foreign Intelligence Service of Russia. The reason he might choose, and by the way, that meeting, they figured out by doing metadata, was tape recorded. So like it aired on television a couple hours after it took place. He wanted them to see him, he wanted the Russian people and the Russian elite to see him humiliating that guy. Same thing, it's a message that goes out, like nobody is above getting on my wrong side on this war.
Well, like when you interviewed, I guess it was 2 weeks ago, the two journalists, and they said that they were talking to many Russian leaders who were clearly opposed to what's happening, but they weren't about to go public in any way.
No, and I think it's, well, it's interesting. Medvedev, again, I've spent a lot of time in the room with him. He's not a natural fascist, right? But he's been saying stuff lately that is insane, like genocidal rhetoric about Ukrainians. Lavrov made this comment the other day that Zelensky is like Hitler because Hitler had Jewish blood. Like, these are guys who started out performing and have become the part because they have nowhere else to go. And by the way, it's a good lesson that what can feel like at the beginning like a small compromise, like, well, I gotta play by these rules to keep my share of the take, or maybe I gotta play by these rules to be in the good graces of a political party. You can look up 10, 20 years later, and the stuff that you're now doing is much more extreme than you ever thought at the beginning. And that's where this question of do they really believe it doesn't matter, because they're acting on it. And whether if they don't believe it, it doesn't mean that they're not going to keep doing it.
You touched on this a few minutes ago, and we don't have time to go into a full history lesson, but I think it's absolutely amazing that Putin's popularity, which may be questionable about the polls, but the organization that did it has viewed as some independence. He now has 83% popularity, where in January it was in the mid-60s. And part of that is because the Russian people may be wanting to see this empire and to see this as a way to go beyond the, quote, humiliation that they felt with the breakup of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, I mean, I start, the main character on Russia in my book is Alexei Navalny, who is now imprisoned, is Putin's chief critic and opponent. And I was FaceTiming with Navalny in the summer of 2020 before he got poisoned and almost killed. And he walked me through this, he appeals to some of the same voters as Putin, which is an interesting dynamic. And he said, I want to explain the humiliation piece. I was a kid, this is Navalny saying, I was a kid who grew up thinking that I lived in the greatest country in the world, the most exceptional country in the world, the country whose ideology was going to shaped the entire world. And I was like, yeah, I know what that's like. So I grew up in the country too, you know? So actually, and we were about the same age, and so I was like, you know, I was on the other side of Rocky IV, you know? And he's like, and he lived in the military towns outside of Moscow, and he's like, imagine if that all collapses, like almost overnight, like, you know, within a year or two. And he said, in his town, there were these huge food shortages, and they started to get rations delivered from the West German army to these Soviet military towns where people didn't have enough food. And Navalny's like, just imagine, like the height of pride in our identity is that we beat the Nazis in World War II, and here we are accepting, you know, candy and from the West Germans. And all the former land that we dominated in Eastern Europe is just running as fast as they can to the West. I think it was a profound, and then meanwhile the 90s become this chaotic period of privatization where some people become mega wealthy, like all these oligarchs, but it gets actually worse for a lot of ordinary Russians in the 90s because it's just chaos, and they lose even the kind of very minimalist net that the Communist Party provided. And then Putin comes along, and he completely speaks to the humiliation and sense of grievance. And he also stabilizes the economy by luck, because basically Putin comes in at right the time that the global economy stabilizes and oil prices really take off. And so suddenly Russia's awash in oil revenue that he can spread around. And that kind of created an initial connection that Putin has been cultivating with the public for 20 years. And I don't even think his numbers are probably that high, but he is tapping into this psychology of a country that could not have been more ripe for both the backlash to losing the Soviet Union, but also the kind of backlash to the excesses of globalization, right? The excesses of inequality, which are extreme in Russia, the excesses of the global war on terror era that seemed to normalize you know, militarized foreign policy, again, all kinds of things. Like Putin could sense how, as a politician, to exploit the psychology of his own people.
And let's just move to China just briefly. I mean, you saw the same thing with Xi Jinping, about how he was able to...
Yeah, and I think this is a really important point that I try to draw through this book, because I look at, okay, the Hungarian example of authoritarianism, which is kind of the Western flavor, if you will, then Russia, which was in many ways a template for Hungary, but then China, which is kind of the future. like if Russia is the kind of regeneration of a really old kind of brand of politics, right? Blood and soil, kind of pre-World War I nationalism. China's the future. And I think the important point for us to understand, though, is Xi Jinping is yes, he's a Marxist-Leninist, but he's a true nationalist in a way that we haven't seen from previous Communist Party leaders, at least since the Cold War. That part of what the Communist Party did when they saw Tiananmen happen and they saw the Soviet Union collapse, and they realized that being just a communist party is not going to provide them enough legitimacy, and it is also going to be a little complicated as they completely open up to global capitalism. What they spent a lot of time doing is creating and engendering in the Chinese public a sense of Chinese nationalism. They rehabilitated Confucius, who had famously hated Confucius. Suddenly they're building huge Confucius statues, they're linking Chinese history to the party, and they're really dialing up anti-American, anti-Western, anti-Japanese themes in their media and their schools. And that had already happened when Xi Jinping comes along and says, okay, now we are confident enough to literally challenge the United States in terms of what is the model for how people are going to live in the 21st century. And we're also motivated by an ideology that is informed by a lot of historical grievance. It's a history of colonialism, history of what they see as American imperialism. And so I think we make a mistake at not seeing the traditional nationalism fused to 21st century, in China's case, technology, and how we look at why leaders might do things that seem to us crazy, right? Nationalism can make people do pretty crazy things. And when you've spent a long time whipping your own public into a frenzy to legitimize your rule.
And you see that with the Uyghurs. I mean, that's why.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, there need to be enemies within, there need to be enemies without. That's always the case. And, you know, I profile in the book the protest movement in Hong Kong. The Chinese narrative of that was CIA financed, Taiwanese financed. You know, these are the enemies at the gates of China. We have to swallow up this city because it's a threat to us. And very much the same way that Putin could cast Ukraine as a threat to Russia when it was the reverse.
You know, we'd like to think that in hindsight is 2020. But when I think back to what's happened with Ukraine and Russia 2008, particularly 2014, there's no easy way to look at this. When you look back, and you were in the White House at the time, is there something that you wish that we had done differently, or that NATO had done differently, or the EU?
Yeah, absolutely. But I'll detail it, but what I'll say, to skip to the end, is there's a bunch of stuff that I think we could have done differently, and the exact same, you know, the same thing might have happened. And that's one of the hardest things about working on foreign policy and government and then reflecting on it on the outside. I mean, you know, what is our recourse in 2014 when Putin annexes Crimea? It's sanctioning frankly, it's versions of the same thing that is American policy now, albeit cranked up. It's sanctioning Russia. What kind of arms do you provide to the Ukrainians? And, you know, what kind of security assurances you prepared to offer Ukraine? And you know, we pushed the Europeans on sanctions and got about as far as we could. I'm sure I would have liked to, at the time, have gone much more broadly after the oligarchs. But I don't know that would have caused Putin to stop what he was doing. I think we started training the Ukrainian military, which made an enormous difference, because the Ukrainian military of today, the one thing Putin did wrong is wait 7 years, because the Ukrainian military started getting trained by the United States in 2014, and so it's a much, much more formidable military today than it was back in 2014. We could have provided them with more arms and heavier weapons or modern systems at that time. We didn't, because we thought it might provoke Putin to say, well, I got to go to Kyiv now before they can arm these guys. We could have given them those arms. I don't know that it would have deterred, I don't think it would have deterred Putin, because from what we see, this is a person who the culmination of his entire life is this war. I mean, everything leads logically to it. And sometimes in history, there are sociopathic leaders with deep ethno-nationalist ideologies who are going to do what they're going to do. I had a crazy experience. Boris Nemtsov, you know, who I mentioned, I kind of look at in this book. I found his daughter, as a friend, sent me an interview he did the day before he was assassinated. He was organizing a protest against the war in Ukraine the next day. No Russians were really going to come because they supported the annexation of Crimea. So the guy asked him basically, like, why are you doing this? And he's like, I'm telling you, Putin is Hitler, Hitler is Putin. It's a one-to-one thing. And, you know, you guys may not agree with me now, but someday people in this country and around the world will hate Putin as much as they hate Hitler. You'll see I'm going to be proven right, you know. And it may have just been that we were inevitably going to get to this point. I'd like to think, you know, we could have maybe increased Ukraine's strength relative to Russia's, but stopping Putin from doing something is not, you know, you can't, there's not, unfortunately, a stop button.
Right. The dollars that we're putting into this are enormous. 33 billion was just announced. That's what President Biden has asked for. How concerned are you that this could expand and not just be a long-out war between Ukraine and Russia, but really go beyond?
I think, first of all, it will expand in the sense that, like, no war ends in any way, shape, or form like you anticipated might at the beginning, right? Think about what you thought the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were going to look like in 2002, 2003. And so there will be all manner of unintended consequences, ripple effects, huge changes to the world order, I think, from this war. I think it'll go on for a long time. The size of that package, $33 billion, is also indicative of like, we're now not just rushing arms in to defend Kyiv, we're like giving them a capacity to stay at war for 5 months, by the way. That $33 billion covers the next 5 months. There's no reason not to believe that, Americans aren't going to be footing the bill for the next 5 months, right? And the weapons, the types of things going in are more intense.
And the intelligence.
And the intelligence that we're sharing. And I think that there are all kinds of risks, right? The Russians decide they need to start getting more aggressive, bombing those weapons coming in. So do they start bombing border sites on the border with Poland? Do they start trying to sabotage things outside of Ukraine? Do the cyber attacks against the United States pick up? Does Russia choose to use chemical weapon that then raises questions? I mean, there are all kinds of things that could risk some form of escalation. I do think my sense is that the Biden administration and European allies writ large are trying to be incredibly disciplined about not getting into the direct conflict. But the reality is we're already in a conflict. We're trying to destroy their economy. We're trying to get Europe to terminate its oil and gas imports from Russia, which will really destroy their economy. We are sharing intelligence on the battlefield with Ukrainians so they can kill Russians. And we're giving the Ukrainians the weapons to kill those Russians. So I feel like the distinctions may start to fray over time, but I still think that it's less likely than it is that we actually end up in a war with Russia.
You've been building up your, sorry about this. You've been building up your fire miles quite a bit over the last few weeks. I think 2 trips to London, Amsterdam, Paris. Do the Europeans have the stomach to continue?
Here's what I did meet with a bunch of European political figures and others lately, and what you hear is that the public opinion, has been galvanized from the bottom up in Europe in a way that they have not seen in a long time. And so, for instance, in London, this is a city that is dependent on the money of Russian oligarchs for a long time. Like, they really are trying to get rid of that, right? There's a sense of, okay, this is the wake-up call that, we should have gotten before, but have now really gotten. And our publics are putting pressure on us to do things. So when you see Europe moving to sanctions or arming the Ukrainians, it's not like a bunch of Winston Churchills over there. It's a bunch of politicians who are like, I got to do something because my own people are demanding that I do something. The flip side of that, though, is there's deep unease about inflation in Europe and potential recession in Europe. They're much more economically vulnerable to price shocks and particularly energy markets than we are. And Putin knows that, right? And one of the things that he has figured out, and the Orban example in this book is a part of it, if he's just making things worse in Europe, it helps far-right nationalist type leaders who will be more likely to be aligned with Putin. So, in other words, like, the longer this goes on and the more kind of chaos he can sow in terms of both feeding inflationary pressures, but also, like, Russia is a prime source of anti-vaccine disinformation campaigns in Europe and has really meddled hard in certain European countries' politics. There's a concern among some Europeans that in the elections that are to come next year, some of these leaders could start to fall. And then what Putin's going to try to do at times is, consume some chunk of Ukraine say, I'm declaring a ceasefire, I'm ready to negotiate peace. The terms of the peace are, you have to let me keep all this, land in Ukraine. The Ukrainians don't agree to it. Some of the Europeans start to get impatient and say, well, these sanctions are really hurting us. Let Putin stop killing, let's go, And that's what's going to be the test of European solidarity.
I don't think I have any luck with this today. You all can hear me. Now it works. There have been three votes before the United Nations, and the results have been quite surprising. Angela Stent recently wrote, "The West against the rest." I wasn't that surprised by the UAE and Saudi Arabia, but I'd like you to comment on it, and also about India.
Well, again, it's been interesting because I sense and deeply appreciate the sentiment that kind of got stirred up in the United States around the outset of the war, of obviously support for the Ukrainians, but also kind of pride that we were playing this role and playing it well. We were releasing this intelligence, we were mobilizing allies, but I started to also sense that I'd hear people start to say things like, and the world is with us, or the world is totally against this war, and I'm like, or the world is not buying the Russian disinformation. It's like, be careful how you use the world, because you're talking about Europe and the United States, because actually beyond that, with the exceptions of kind of Japan and South Korea and Australia, what you think, the world is totally sitting this one out, They're not joining us in sanctions, they're not joining us in condemnation. They're
half of the world's population is not with us.
Well, and they're very open to the Russian disinformation campaigns or just the straight up Russian arguments, right? So if you're China, you're getting your information filtered through the Chinese Communist Party filter, which I tell you what comes out on the other end. It looks a lot more like what Putin wants those billion people to see than others. But India, Brazil, South Africa, these countries that have the kind of, the ex-non-aligned movement, Cold War countries, to them, they're very open to the argument about what about Iraq and what's the difference and why should I care about Ukraine? And these sanctions are going to be problematic for us, whereas Putin invading Ukraine was, not as problematic as the sanctions in response to it for some of them. And that's going to take a lot of work from the United States to try to push back on that. Another piece of that is that this trend, you mentioned India, Narendra Modi, Prime Minister of India, deeply sectarian nationalist leader who shares a ton in common with Putin in terms of how he thinks politics should operate, right? Not everything. I don't, I'm not suggesting there's a one-to-one there, but Bolsonaro in Brazil, same thing. He was in Russia shortly before the war. Here's another nationalist leader. So the proliferation of this kind of strong man and its man, pretty telling that none of these leaders are women, of this kind of brand of politics does create kind of convenient, if not partners, then people who will look at Putin and say, well, why would I want to jump on board an effort to, if you're in Saudi Arabia and you're hearing the US talking about this as a struggle between democracies and autocracies, I tell you, the Saudis know which side they're going to be on when that struggle ends up happening, and it's not our team.
Last time we talked, we spoke quite a bit about Iran and the JCPOA. Our mutual friend Ned Price was quoted yesterday saying that the State Department and the U.S. administration is really preparing for both eventualities, that there may be an agreement or there may not be. You were so involved with the Iran agreement. What are your thoughts today?
I don't think looks like there's going to be agreement in the near term, because I think that the price for the U.S. coming back into that agreement was to lift, we don't have to go into the weeds here, but after Trump pulled out, he imposed a bunch of new sanctions on Iran on top of the old ones. And the Iranian position is, okay, we have to go back to essentially where the sanctions were when Trump pulled out. And there's one very politically sensitive sanction, which is designated the Iranian Revolutionary Guard as a terrorist organization, which is a great symbolically, but does nothing practically. It's not like,
And does that require Congress to do that?
no, it doesn't. But it's not like the IRGC is like trying to trade, openly, that these people live in the black market. All that said, it feels to me like the administration doesn't want to take on that political fight. Here's the problem. Do we really need like a nuclear brinksmanship in the Middle East now on top of everything else? And it's kind of like a not entirely adjacent crisis, because Iran is a partner of Russia's. Russia may see there to be some interest in multiple crises and multiple fronts. Oil prices further go up in Iran scenarios. The U.S. has these painfully strained relations with Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So there's some incentive for the Iranians to make their move, if they're not going to get the deal, to kind of a nuclear brinksmanship. And so whatever political, as someone who's took all the scars of the Iran fights in the Obama years, so I know how much those scars, stick. I write in the book about being tailed by Black Cube, a private intelligence outfit of former Mossad officials. As much as I know that stinks, the only thing worse is than getting criticized by a bunch of right-wingers is having a nuclear armed Iran on top of a war in Ukraine. I wouldn't want that.
Elon Musk and Twitter.
So this is the big,
You write a lot about it.
I write a lot about this, yeah. So I talk about it, how at the end of working on this book, Obama asked me to kind of explain what I've been working on. I explained to him, and he said, well, it's kind of dark. And then he's like, the thing is, there's always been a fight between democracy and autocracy. Like, what's different today, right? So, because a lot of what you're describing, the basically political clash between the people I profile here are dissidents and opposition figures and young protesters and journalists and this kind of entrenched ethno-nationalist authoritarian trend. He's like, what's different today? And without batting an eye, having worked on this, what's different today is technology and the degree to which it can scale up all the negative aspects of autocracy. And the real two negative aspects are the information piece and then the surveillance piece. On the information piece, look, it wasn't possible 10 years ago for there to be a QAnon. It just wasn't possible for there to be a scenario in which a huge swath of Americans believe that the world is governed by a cabal of child sex traffickers, right? When Barack Obama ran for president in 2008, we had a phenomenon of forwarded emails, right? Someone would write an email, they forward to their friends about, Obama, he was actually born in Kenya and he's a secret Muslim, and it lived in email. And it got around enough that we'd have to give our field organizers talking points no, he was born in Hawaii in this state. But even though he was president and as in people's lives as a public figure could be for the next several years, far more people believed that Obama was born outside of America at the end of the Obama presidency than the beginning. That's just technology. That is basically the degree to which particularly social media platforms have their business model is meant to make you as triggered and addicted as possible, and it's just kind of created and then poured gasoline onto these very corrosive conspiracy theory minded information ecosystems that just scale up crazy, right? And to get to Elon Musk, this is America that created these platforms, decided that they wouldn't be regulated. It's been a tool of disinformation for a country like Russia around the world, tool of surveillance for countries like China around the world. And at a moment when there's some awareness, I think, even within these companies that this is a public health hazard. We have to regulate social media in the same way that we had to make people wear seatbelts because it's killing people. Elon Musk taking Twitter over as a vanity project for his kind of Silicon Valley bro free speech debates is not the way we're going to solve the problem.
Let's hear from you. I don't know what we're doing on microphones. Raise your hand if you have a question, and I think I'll...
I can start with one if you don't.
Oh, there we go.
No, I don't want to start.
Right over here.
Go ahead, I just thought if there were a big man.
To get back to Ukraine for a minute, what's the story with the Russian army?
So I think one way to think about this is that an army is a reflection of the society itself that it comes from. And so the Russian army is, number one, heavily dependent on people who don't really want to be in the Russian army. You know, like they not only they're conscripts, a lot of the people fighting in Ukraine are literally people from these regions of eastern Ukraine, Luhansk and Donetsk, who were forced to join the army. It was like, you have to join the army. So there's huge morale problems. They've spent a lot of money on their army and their military, but there's tremendous corruption, just like in Russian society. There's an enormous cut skimmed off the top. So even though Russia's had this, multi-$100 billion military modernization, like a big chunk of that money went into buying those yachts that you're seeing towed away, right? And so, that's undercut their capacity. Then they haven't been using their conventional military to do most of what they've been doing in recent years, because Crimea was just sent in some special forces, and the Ukrainians didn't really fight there for a lot of reasons, including the fact that it is actually very majority ethnic Russian. So this is the first time that they really had to kind of deploy the full weight of their army since the wars in Chechnya. Those wars didn't go well, and their reaction when the wars didn't go well in Chechnya was to just start destroying cities, right? And so the army is corrupt, it's got low morale, and it's totally sadistic in its use of violence. And in some ways, that's actually a reflection of what Putinism is. That is Putinism. It'll be interesting to see their capacity to sustain. The reason I think Putin's going to have to at least try to pause and say, I want to do a ceasefire and negotiate at times, is not because he wants to end the war, it's because he's going to have to give his military time to kind of catch its breath and then try to peel off Europeans.
Well, I'm curious to see what we're going to see on May 9th, when you typically have those long parades with all the tanks and weapons, and all of those, many of them have been destroyed or in Ukraine. I saw some questions in the back. Keep your hands up so that Jesse can see where to go. We got one over there. Where else? Jesse, just work the room.
Hi, I think I'm butting in on someone else, but Ben, I wanted to ask you something about, you kind of floated over the Saudi issue with Russia, but here's a distinction there. We have treated them as very close allies, and I was quite involved with that, and they've received some very sensitive technology from us and a lot of cooperation. So I guess the bigger question is, can the U.S. maintain a position? Well, first, how do you see the U.S. Position in the Middle East these days? But also, can we operate there transactionally the way our friends do and still have any influence? Or have we kind of given away the store because it's underwritten the cost of a lot of our own military advancement? And I think that's not a big secret to a lot of people. Where do we go from here on that? Because it's been, it's not as though it's not the same as, Seychelles or someone else not going along with us. This is a little bit bigger than that.
Yeah. So as you may know, at the end of the Obama years, I was kind of like a bit of PNG with our Saudi friends, and because I was like an internal critic of the push that MBS was this reformer. But like the bigger problem that I sense, and I know you must sense it too, is that putting aside my values positions, which are important and I'll come back to in a second, our interests were not aligning. on things. So the idea is this is like a cold interest-based set of relationships that we have with the Saudis and Emiratis. What they were doing across the region, from Yemen to Libya and in between, was often at odds with our preferred course of action. Never mind their virulent opposition to the Iran agreement, never mind their kind of desire to see us kind of get more in Iran's face in a way that could lead to conflict. Never mind, the way they were playing different sides of conflicts where, as you know, it would have been much easier for us if we all just picked the same side. So that's just on pure interest. Then, I believe, it's why I wrote this book, that if you separate out any values proposition from what the United States is in the world, not only does that begin to make us not different from Russia and China that much, but it accelerates this trend. There has to be the pendulum has been swinging so hard in this direction away from democracy. There has to be a pushback. There has to be America with some other like-minded countries taking some high ground and saying, guys, we say enough, right? This is shaping, it's distorting our foreign policy, it's distorting American capitalism, which is increasingly, looking at China and the Gulf for instructions, And so when I hear President Biden say we're in a war of democracies versus autocracies, I think, well, yeah, but why is the Saudis and the Emiratis, why are we trying to bring them on our team in that fight? Because these big structural issues are going to have to be solved. The bifurcation of supply chains, the future of the internet, the future of how technology is used, what expectations American businesses should have about what is done with their products to repress people. This is all going to run through Saudi and the UAE. That's, and at a certain, and right now the biggest, constituencies for the status quo or for you better make up with those people are really our pieces of our business community and finance community and our military. And I get it. If I were them, I would want to not have that relationship broken. But the reality is, I read an article recently, it was yet another in a series of the Saudis are upset with us. And then it was a list of all the things that the Saudis are upset about, and none of which they were right about. So basically you're saying that the goal of this relationship is for us to have a good relationship with them, and the way that we have a good relationship with them is by doing everything they want us to do. And if we don't do everything they want us to do, then they go to Washington and use all their influence to complain that we don't know what we're doing.
Ben, how much money did they pay the lobbyist?
And how much money did they pay? I think that's who paid. The funny thing is, I truly believe that that's who paid to have me surveilled by Black Cube, and the world in which the Emiratis are paying a bunch of yeah, exactly. But anyway, I won't go there. But all this to say is it's okay. I won't go there. Yeah.
Let's take another question. We'll take a few more. And who's had their hand up for a long time and has not been recognized? Okay, we'll head back up there afterwards. Go ahead.
Okay. I'm going to switch gears a little bit. In the news this week was extraordinarily high temperatures in India and Pakistan, 112, 114 degrees. And more importantly, it's not getting cooler at night. It's not dropping below 85 degrees. So we're looking at a future of the most populous country in the world, a lot of people dying or migrating. And of course, that's not confined to India. Here we're looking at a 4-day wind event over the coming weekend that is unprecedented, and we see the results around us. So what about climate change and the fate of democracy around the world? How do you think these, we're looking at mass mortality and migration.
I got it. I'm with you on it. I think it should be the organizing principle for international relations in the 21st century. I think climate change is the most important national security issue, economic issue, public health issue of my daughter's lifetimes, and we should literally be we need to develop a new sense of national purpose in this country. We need to develop institutions or modernize international institutions to be relevant. Climate change is actually a vehicle to be trying to do that at a much greater scale than we have. I think that the connection to democracy, and this is why I think they are connected. You know, I was in Glasgow at the COP summit. Who wasn't there? Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, right? I think that public opinion is precisely because governments don't like to do things that are hard, like transition your economies. Public opinion is the only thing that can press people to change. And I should have said, I was gonna say on the Saudis, there's another one where we disagree. But like if you look at China, the reason that they moved just to get to where Paris Agreement is not, everybody says, well, it's because they're autocracies and they can snap their fingers and make, that's part of it. It's because the only bottom-up public opinion threat to the Chinese Communist Party was environmental. It's what we saw in all the data, that the protests in China about air quality and pollution, it was the nexus between climate change and pollution and air quality. It was an authoritarian government responding to public opinion. Putin has no climate policy. MBS has no climate policy except to diversify his fossil fuel drenched sovereign wealth fund with some clean energy investments he can talk about. But I think that democracies are going to be more capable of dealing with the climate crisis, in part because they're going to be more susceptible to public opinion, and public opinion generationally is being appropriately radicalized on this issue.
Yes, sir. Let's come on down, Brooke. This man's kept his hand up. All right, take the man right right here. Then we'll go back up there.
No.
Go ahead, sir.
I agree completely that climate change and what's been going on with the climate has got to be the biggest national security issue. I've heard that for years. I came to Los Alamos to work on it in 1978. So why hasn't anything happened?
So
Why are we, I mean, you know, I'm really pretty angry about this. And it's been every administration has bellied up to big oil and gas.
I think, so I'd say a couple things. The first thing I'd say is that like there was, I felt like in the second term of the Obama administration, we were beginning to do what was necessary in terms of what I've found very interesting, and I know, there's some former diplomats in the room, the way in which the United States got from kind of where international climate talks were in 2013 to just a Paris Accord, which is a floor, admittedly, in 2015 is climate change became a top 1 or 2 issue in every bilateral relationship and every multilateral engagement that we had. That, in other words, instead of it being this kind of a side thing, right, there are the diplomats and the generals and then there are these climate envoys over here, suddenly it's like, no, if like we're going to sit down to talk to Brazil, we're talking about the Amazon first. Or when we talk to China, the first thing we're talking about is not North Korea or Iran or whatever, it's climate change. And it's a different issue in each country, right? But the South Koreans were suddenly talking about financing coal plants, right? At the G20, we're talking about phasing out fossil fuel subsidies. But what it takes, I mean, on getting our house in order domestically and spending enough money and passing the right legislation, that's a matter of politics, and that's a matter of changing public opinion. But in terms of foreign policy and national security, I think what it takes is saying, there's not like some appendage of the government that does this. You know, John Kerry has an office, and it's saying like we are integrating into all of the core functions of American foreign policy and national security, climate change as the leading priority. And so like, if that's what every other government knows is priority 1 with the Americans, like that's a different conversation than going to them in the run up to a summit and saying, hey, can you get a good deliverable on methane, you know? It's gotta be like part of everything that we're doing. I do think though, unless and until the politics changes in the Republican Party, like there's this inevitable kind of ceiling where yes, democratic governments should do more, but we would have, we would like to do. The combination of a hostile Supreme Court and if you don't have Congress makes it very difficult. I am disappointed that the climate funding that the Biden people, there was a showcase of their agenda, seems like it's kind of slowly dying on a vine. That I think we may look back at that as a pretty terrible missed opportunity that just pushes this further into the private sector.
Jesse, let's be sure we get whoever had their hand up there. Thanks for your patience.
I'm going to go back to Europe. You briefly talked about Germany, and it seems like one of the outcomes of this may be that Germany becomes a military power again. And I'm just wondering, when you look out, what do you think the impact of how Germany is kind of reacting to what's going on in the war in Ukraine and their commitment to spending more on NATO? And historically, they had a very nationalistic culture. Do you see that waking up again and potentially becoming an issue in the future? We see them completely as a democratic nation now and in a totally different environment than they were 75 years ago. But, it does seem like perhaps there may be a change just based on, what's going on in Ukraine and their reaction to it.
Yeah, so I describe it here like when after Crimea and around that time when there's a lot of pressure on Europe, Brexit, Obama was giving a lot of speeches about European values and in Europe, and he went to Angela Merkel and he said, you need to speak out more forcefully, get in this fight. Like, you need to speak out more forcefully about European identity, and what the values are that Germany represents. And she said, you don't always want a charismatic German chancellor. It's generally not ended well. So whenever people ask me for an example of Angela Merkel's dry sense of humor, like, that's it. But the bigger point she's making is what you're describing, which is that the part of the reason Germans are not dumb, they're actually very smart, and like part of the reason that they had these commercial ties to Russia is that they kind of believed that, given the nature of the wars that Germany and Russia had fought in history, which pretty awful, some of the most brutal violence in the history of human beings, it's like, maybe we should have pipelines with these people so it's less likely we fight a war. And that proved to not be the right approach, but the motivation behind it was not purely profit-driven. It was in part, I think, a fear of the Pandora's box of, spending more on defense and being more adversarial towards Russia and the like. I think that as a general matter, it's something to be mindful. This is a sea change in Germany, where they're suddenly spending this money in defense. They're suddenly allowing German defense manufacturers the weapons that they make to be exported to Ukraine. They've gone along with sanctions that go far beyond what people thought they would do. They don't look that excited to be doing it, though. So it's not as if like there's some firebrand leader who's driving this train. It's more like public opinion is like, we need to help the Ukrainians and we need to do these things. But what I look for is like this trend, right? Where this goes in terms of authoritarian ethno-nationalism. If this trend is kind of tamed and peters out, I don't worry about this. If Germany's increasingly willingness to flex its muscles in the defense space is channeled into its European Union and NATO foreign policy and not a German policy, I don't worry about it as much. But if we're in a world of continually unraveling institutions and increasing nationalism, and 20 years, 30 years from now, there's like a very distinct German and French and British military and foreign policies informed by nationalism, that's not great, So where this whole trend shakes out, I think, is going to shape what happens in Germany a lot. I think the other thing to watch is that they have taken this more forceful stance on Russia. They have not on China. That they clearly don't want to. So again, the battle between democracies and autocracies. America is compromised by some of our autocratic friends, and I think most of our democratic friends don't think that they're in that battle. if that battle includes China, and how can it not? And so I think the framework through which we look at the world, we have to, if I was to do one thing in the world, I'd be trying to consolidate the views of democracy. What do we as a collective, as a small d democratic community, what is our view of what should happen in the next 20, 30 years? On technology, on climate change, on supply chains, on all these things. Because if we have common positions amongst ourselves, we're going to be in such a better position to deal with what's coming than if there's a German version, an American version, and a Brussels version, and a Tokyo version. Never mind India.
And before we turn everybody loose to buy your book, or if they've already purchased a book, to have it signed and visit with you. In the Atlantic article that you wrote last month, you talked about this is such a pivotal time. You mentioned the hinge of history. Give us some closing remarks about what you meant by that.
I mean, I think that what's clear to me is that there was a period of time after the Cold War that was marked by very distinct attributes, like American hegemony in the world, globalization in the kind of like a wave crashing and seeing how far it can reach, and a set of assumptions about how societies itself were going to operate. And that period is over. It just is a fact. Like, America is not a hegemon. The globalization has receded in many ways, not always. And I guess two things from the book that jump out at me. What comes next? I think Ukraine is if we just return to history. There's nothing unusual about the war in Ukraine. That's how history usually turns out. And it's how it always turned out until the middle of the 20th century. And an ethno-nationalist leader invading a neighbor for some mix of bloodlust, territory, resources, and ideologies, that's not a new concept. So I think the Ukraine version of what comes next is, we could end up back in that history. And that may not be limited to Ukraine, that could be other places. I think the other thing is I write in the book about being in Shanghai in 2017. I was with President Obama at the end of the year. So he'd been out of office for like a year. And I was not quite ready to start my midlife crisis, so I was still traveling around with him. And he was, I guess, in his midlife crisis, so he's giving paid speeches in Shanghai. And I'm joking. And I get woken up in my hotel room at 10:30 at night, and the front desk is the vice foreign minister wants to see you. I'm like, well, that's kind of strange. I'm retired. I'm 40, but I'm retired. I'm not in government. And so this guy comes up, and he's got a minder with him. And I know this guy. He's responsible for kind of North America when we're in government. And he makes a bunch of small talk, and then he gets into the reason he's there, which is, he says, we understand that President Obama is going to India next. And I said, yeah. And he said, we understand he's preparing to meet the Dalai Lama, but he called them, the Tibetan terrorist, whatever. And I said, yeah. And he's like, well, it'd be great. And he basically gives me a démarche. People in our audience have had those. It would offend Xi Jinping and a billion Chinese people if this meeting went forward, and how could you consider doing this right after you're in China? And the same strong-arming they do to everybody, they're willing to do to me with Barack Obama, next door. But that's not what was weird about it. I've gotten that message in government. What was weird about it is I'd only been put in email contact with the Dalai Lama person that day. We had not announced the meeting. And so they were basically saying, hey, we were monitoring your email, and we didn't like this thing we saw, and so we're going to wake you up and make you really uncomfortable about it. And so it's pretty disconcerting. So I walk out, and I'm in Shanghai, and I don't know if you guys have ever seen the Bund or been there, but the Shanghai skyline was right there, and right on the riverfront, the skyline, and it looks like the future, right? It's like Blade Runner, and mixed with just uber wealth, and everybody's taking selfies with selfie sticks. It's a famous place to go to take a selfie. And so I'm kind of like looking at the future. There's this enormous prosperity, and there's this omnipresent technology, but there's also this palpable feeling like I'm not free. Like they are in all these devices that we're holding, and they're using it to shape how we think and what our incentives are, disincentives. And yet, as I'm looking at this, I'm thinking, well, this is actually the logical next step, because if you take hyper-capitalism and hyper-national security mania and kind of hyper-technology, three of the big characteristics of this period of the post-Cold War years, and you just stripped all of the democracy out of it, like you would get what I was looking at in Shanghai. And that's what happened to the people I profiled in Hong Kong. That is actually an alternate view of not just government, but like society, like how society should function. And it's very powerful. And so the hinge of history point, it's a long answer, I know, but I wanted to get it in, is, okay, it's going to be different, right? The future is going to be different than this last period. And I think we all sense that in this country. I think it's part of the reason why the battles in this country are so intense, is that what American identity is, we don't know. Like, that has to be determined. And that's, where it end is saying, like, the answer to how we answer that question is hugely important, because we could end up in the old history, which is what we're seeing in Ukraine. We could end up in the kind of techno-dystopia I described, which is China, or what? What's our answer? What are we bringing to that competition? And I think none of us in this room, no matter what our politics, would think we're bringing our A game, in particular when it comes to democracy. But we have to, not just for our own sake, but I think for the world's.
I think I'll go back and read the last paragraph in your book so I can go to bed.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ben.